I'm Jean-Marie Guéhenno. I'm the moderator of this panel, former Undersecretary General at the United Nations, and now a professor at Columbia University. This panel is sadly very timely. International humanitarian law is under attack, and we need to discuss it as a matter of urgency. I'm going to introduce each member of the panel as I give them the floor. But I think today we need not theoretical thinking, but very practical action on an unfolding situation that requires rapid, immediate response. And to start, I'm going to ask Mr. Udo Ilo, who represents an NGO called Civilians in Conflict, a very important NGO that helps armies, but also armed groups around the world respect, or try to respect humanitarian law. I'm going to ask him his view on the sort of state of play of international humanitarian law, not just in Gaza, that obviously we are going to discuss during this panel, but in the world at large, because there are many other conflicts that we don't discuss, and sometimes we don't discuss enough. So, Udo.
Thank you very much. That's a very tough task that you've given me. But I want to frame my intervention around 4 points. The first one is that the international humanitarian law is only as good as its implementation. Understandably, after the Second World War, there was this need to mitigate human sufferings, to ensure that war doesn't visit untold hardship on civilians, on people who are not in active conflict, and all of that. Of course, that whole idea is premised on the dignity of the human person. And we are now at a point where we are beginning to question whether or not the international humanitarian law framework is even adequate. Is it even fit for purpose? But the reality is that it's only as good as much as we implement it. And the first contradiction is that a number of countries whose military power and political influence helped to take this negotiation for the Geneva Convention to the finish line, who by their role and by the authority are supposed to be the underwriters of these principles and these values, are actually the ones who are undermining the same framework that they are supposed to protect by their opportune position in the global order. And so when you have these countries play this kind of disruptive and hypocritical role around the international humanitarian law regime, it hollows it out. It makes it not to be fit for purpose. We are now in a situation where the identity of the aggressor or the identity of the victim determines how the world responds. And you cannot necessarily maintain a strong framework of protection in an environment where it's like an a la carte. People pick and choose what they want to do. And of course, there's no accountability. The second contradiction is that we also in a place where countries who are invading other countries are standing in the forefront of advocating for maybe ceasefire in Gaza. Whereas the countries who say that, you know, we are democratic, we respect human dignity, we protect human rights, are the ones obstructing a process that can actually save lives. And so it's a contradiction that makes it also confusing. So what exactly is the world order? What exactly are the standards that we're supposed to follow? When it's like a flip-flop, everybody's doing one thing today or another thing tomorrow. And so the place of politics in the implementation and the respect of international humanitarian laws is undermining its efficacy, undermining its credibility. and undermining the protection of civilians in conflict. The third point is that because the state parties, who are actually the custodians of this very important set of principles and norms, are behaving this way, we are also losing the ability to rein in non-state parties. In Sudan, as we speak, just this month, more than 900 people were killed. We are hearing increasingly cries of a possible ethnic cleansing going on in Sudan. In Ethiopia, it is not yet over. In DRC, there are crises. In Yemen, there are crises. All over the world, we are seeing non-state actors also behaving in a way that undermines the global order of international humanitarian law. But the state actors have not really given any sense of moral leadership that can allow us to rein in all these other characters. The final point I want to make is that we need to acknowledge that there is no alternative. Frankly, we have to protect this system for us to be able to protect civilians, for us to be able to protect all of us here in this room. Because oftentimes when we have this conversation about international humanitarian law, it seems like we are talking about something utopian or something out there or something abstract. But I also need us to understand that as we are having this conversation here, kids are dying in Gaza. That as we're having this conversation here, people in Sudan are getting brutalized by a military that has refused to listen to anybody. As we're having this conversation here, in Ukraine, people are not sure if they're going to see the next day. So these are actually lived realities. And if there's anything we've learned in the last couple of years, is that these conflicts know no boundaries. So we're not at a point where we say, oh, we are safe, we're insulated from this problem. So if we don't create a system where we respect something, where we have some guiding principles on how we manage conflict amongst ourselves, all of us are imperiled, all of us are in danger. And I want us to approach this conversation from the point of view that this is existential. This is not something abstract. This is something that affects all of us. And increasing voices of citizens across the world about the way countries should behave is something we need to support. We have to create a different set of pressure points that can force our political leaders to do the right thing. We have to invite the business community to be able to also, the way we talk about climate change, child labor, let's start talking about the protection of civilians in conflict. Because we are living in a world where, frankly, the only rule that is constant is that power is right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, what you say is essentially that the lessons of World War II have been forgotten, that after World War II, after the massive civilian victims of World War II, there was a sense that you had to have a legal framework that would, as much as possible, protect the civilians from the horrors of war. And sometimes, in many situations, you feel that the civilians are not just the collateral victims, they are the principal victims of conflict in many situations. Now, I would want to turn to Hassan Salameh. Hassan Salameh has been a minister in Lebanon, has been a close aide to Kofi Annan. He was the envoy of the United Nations in Libya. And I would want to ask him about his assessment of the situation in Gaza and in very practical terms, because time is of the essence. What can be done today to alleviate the suffering of the people in Gaza?
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. Let's assume that what the government in Gaza is telling us is propaganda. So I'm not going to listen to anything or take out the figures that are given, how many people have been killed and etc. Let me ask you one question. Today, Israel said that it has undergone 3,300 air attacks against Gaza since October the 7th. 3,300 air attacks and 880 helicopter attacks. These are the Israeli army figures for today, since October the 7th. I invite you to imagine what these attacks can produce in a population that was squeezed in a strip of land of 370 square kilometers, divided into two now, like 200 square kilometers, because the northern part of the strip has been a case where the population was forced to leave to the south. So if you do this mental calculation in your head, you will come to the solution, to the evident, logical conclusion that whatever the belligerents say, 3,300 air attacks plus 880 helicopter attacks, I'm not counting the artillery yet, can only produce thousands of people killed. So when the figure 10,000 people killed is mentioned, it is not propaganda. It is not propaganda. It's the logical conclusion of how the war has unfolded. So, putting aside the political side of the story, let's concentrate for a second on a humanitarian situation. To the question, is a humanitarian international law being respected? The answer is clearly no. Is the international community or the leading powers in the world unhappy with it? They don't tell us. Is the Security Council meeting to say this is not acceptable? The answer is no. So we are in a situation where a clear violation of international humanitarian law is taking place and the world is silent. This will affect those who are dying or being injured, probably around 30,000 people injured, or forced to leave their homes. But this also will affect the future of multilateralism and the credibility of international organizations and leading state in the system. What can be done today? I would say the first thing to do is to bring back power to the Shifa hospital immediately, where you have dozens of kids in incubators, where you have 600 people injured without water nor electricity since 10 a.m. this morning, immediately. Second, you have 730 trucks full of medicine and food on the border, on the Rafah crossing point. These 730 trucks are there for 3 days and not allowed to go in. You should inspect them. They have been inspected by the Egyptian side. But you want to inspect them again, especially that since yesterday, there are now X-ray machine, quite expensive, that can inspect a truck in less than 3 minutes. They are there, 2 of them. And allow these 730 trucks to go inside Gaza now, today, not tomorrow, not the day after, because people are starving, people are incredibly thirsty, and you do not need to inflict such collective punishment if you want to reestablish your deterrence capability. You don't need that. You are just making people suffer for nothing. And the third thing you can do is, of course, to stop calling for a new displacement of people. You should know that 74% of the population in Gaza is made of refugees from other parts of Palestine who have gone to Gaza as refugees already. So you are now compelling them to be a refugee a second time within Gaza, which is, again, 740 square kilometers, by moving them from the north, which is more populated, to the south. You are saying, I am going to only bomb the north. But I can tell you, most of the bombing in the past 48 hours has taken place against Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is to the extreme south of the band, on the border with Egypt. So it's not true that if you go south, you are safe. This is not true. And stop telling them that they should cross into Sinai provisionally, because that would be a third exile for these refugees who have come already from some villages in Palestine as a refugee to Gaza, now moved from the north to the south, and now you are asking them to go again to a different place. So there are humanitarian things you can do. But my last point is the following. Humanitarian is a great thing, as long as it is not an alibi for political impotence. And what we are seeing here is full political impotence by leading states in the world, by international organizations, doubled with a humanitarian impotence as well. In other conflict, humanitarian has played the role of a sort of alibi to say that we are politically unable to do anything, so we are dealing with the humanitarian issue. In this case, we are doing nothing. Nothing has been done on the political side between the Israeli and the Palestinians for 10 years. The last time the peace process, so-called peace process, had a meeting was in the year 2014. And nothing has been done since. So I hear all these heads of state telling me they are for the two-state solution. What did you do in the past 10 years to advance that solution? You had 130,000 settlers in the West Bank in the year 1993, the Oslo Accord year. You have now 5 times this figure in the West Bank. So what have you been doing to push the two-state solution? Why should I believe you now that you call for the two-state solution? Mr. Biden, Mr. Macron, Mr. whoever, why do I have to believe you now while you have been doing nothing in the past 10 years to push for this solution? So in other conflicts, humanitarians has been used as an alibi for political impotence. In this case, you have a paralysis of politics and an equal paralysis of humanitarian action. And this is just unbearable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Peter Wagner, who will not address the political issues, the fundamental political issues that you raised, because he works in the European Commission, in the part of the European Commission that manages the instruments. So I would like him to address the question of the paralysis of the humanitarian response and what can be done to overcome that paralysis.
No, on that part, very briefly, I think the EU has multiplied its humanitarian aid. And if you just follow the statements on a nearly daily basis, we are, and also behind the scenes, working on making sure that access is improving. But let me also refer a little bit back to the wider context, as said also by Udo at the very beginning, because we who are globally setting in place instruments and actions in support of the foreign policy, we have a bit of experience from other contexts. On that one, I think one could now generally refer to all our, let's say, legal framework. We are reporting very regularly on what we do on international humanitarian law in general. And indeed, we can only confirm that these reports have, over time, not shown an improving picture. That's for sure. But then when we come to the examples of what we do, we think there are numerous instruments that we have and that maybe are not yet completely used. Now, in the case of the EU, we are still putting together some of the instruments that we might then deploy. or made at least an offer to deploy them. That let me describe maybe therefore on the example of previous work or still ongoing sometimes work what we are doing. We are, and that includes a number of the colleagues, partners here on the podium, working with international partners, for example, Geneva Call, for example, in Myanmar, where we are working with local militia, building their capacity that they are aware of their obligations vis-à-vis international humanitarian law and human rights, and we're really trying to build that. We also then, depending on the real needs in the specific contexts, are trying to support their work that is then even more targeted, because in some contexts you clearly see it's mainly women and children, you could say generally, but in some cases even more than generally, where they are the main victims of armed conflicts. Other still ongoing action where we are getting increasingly demands to do more is in Ukraine. We get the demands to do more from the Ukrainian side, and that is inter alia also again now here with the Geneva Call, where we're trying to really teach on the or inform on the principles for the delivery of humanitarian access and assistance and the facilitation of all of that. For us, it is there really, and I personally appreciate very much the people doing it, because they go sometimes into the forests where the troops are being trained, even in ongoing conflicts, as far as they can go, and try to make them aware at the bottom of the command chain on really how to behave vis-à-vis civilian populations, etc. A third example is Afghanistan, where a number of actions have been underway. That was also, as far as we could, working with armed organizations like the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan on commitments to behave differently, on commitments to protect civilians. We worked there very much through a number of organizations on what are the principles when it comes to local communities. We are looking there very much at what are the vulnerabilities in the different regions in specific countries, and we are really trying to inform there, not only at the government level, because I think the big public debates, and you will discuss that afterwards, are happening elsewhere. But it is very important that in each of these conflicts, also those who are on the ground are as well as possible informed and repeatedly informed of what it is about, the context that they are working in. Because what we've maybe had forgotten, what maybe came a bit to our awareness again in the context of the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine, is that even if you go into these with all the good intentions, in the process of fighting, there are always degradations that are happening at the lower level, which you will have to continue to address. That is something where we are doing similar work in the Lake Chad region, Central African Republic, and we were convinced that they are contributing to alleviating the pressure on the population. But, and now let's say moving a bit upwards again, at the end, we are also always having available instruments of mediation, because we think that, again, at all levels, the constant exchange, notably in situations like the current ones, are important, and that is where we are having a number of instruments available. Usually you talk at the earliest about it when everything is over, and usually also you talk mainly about it when it was a success, but we should not underestimate that a lot of that work is going on, and that is some of the parts that we are financing as well.
Thank you very much. I think the challenge that you have is that as we see the events unfolding in Gaza, there's a sense of urgency that we were reminded of by Hassan Salameh, and that the European Union has to get all its member states aligned on to take some fundamental decisions, and that takes time, and that gap is a gap during which many lives can be lost. But I want to turn to Alain de Letros, because you are actually one of the organization that was just mentioned by Peter Wagner, the Geneva Call, based in Geneva, with the vision that you talk to almost anybody that doesn't kill you, so it gives you, if I may say, it's risky, but it gives you more flexibility. And as you look at this conflict, and I know you look not just at this conflict, but many other conflicts, including many groups in the Middle East, what do you think can be done to engage more, and what are the consequences of not doing what maybe we should do?
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, and you're right. I mean, one of the criteria, the few criteria we have not to engage an armed group is because this armed group would kill us. And those ones who don't want to engage at all are a minority. What I say here is probably going against popular perceptions, but the vast majority of the armed groups that Geneva engages are willing to be engaged and are willing to ensure that their troops and ranks do change behavior. But what has changed, that has been immediately underlined by my friend Udo and by all the other speakers in the last 4 years, I would say, not more than this, is that the very guarantors of the international order, the very guarantors of the strength of the international conventions, the states, are now bluntly overlooking their obligation as parties to the Geneva Conventions, as we can see in the two biggest wars we have in the world right now, that Gassam has underlined several times. But it's not only that they bluntly disregard it, it's that they've changed also the rhetoric they use to justify their deep misregard for their obligation under these conventions. They use a language, a narrative from the convention saying, we are being attacked. You know that this is also what Russia says. Russia says it has been attacked. It has not attacked Ukraine, it has been attacked, right? And okay, with Israel has been attacked recently, we've seen that. But what I would like to underline also with the examples that Peter gave with Ukraine. Ukraine is for us a very good example. Before you remember in 2014 there were an attack on Crimea, and then 2022 full-fledged attack on Kiev and the rest of the country. But in 2018, Geneva started working there with all these defense groups. On the Ukrainian side of the front line with a group like Azov, you know, Pravy Sector, Georgian Legion, Kraken in the north around Kharkiv. And on the other side, the troops or the combatants of the two self-proclaimed de facto republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. On the Ukrainian side, we've been very successful in the sense that these groups wanted to know what they cannot do in combat, and they have behaved. And they are behaving, and I can tell you, my colleague who is sitting here with me, we just visited them a few months ago on the front line. You go into the room, you see the faces of these young guys. It's very difficult for them to accept that they have to continue respecting these rules. And some of the feedback we got is if we had respected everything, the Russians would be in Kiev. But there are two elements, or three, that are essential for success. A, their leadership is quite clear. They don't want these groups to misbehave. So they are quite clear, all the commanders down the line, to tell them after a training that our colleagues did there, one of the commanders went on the stage afterwards and said, the day we will be celebrating our victory, if you have not listened to what Geneva told you today, we will be drinking for our victory and you will have prosecutors on your heels. So for IHL to be respected, the political will to punish down the line those who don't respect is essential. The second element there is that, and not only there, we'll come to other places in the Middle East also, is the sense by the combatants that these rules are theirs, that it is their own ethics to respect these rules, that it is not something written in the West, it's part of our culture. As I can tell you what the Taliban commander told me, he said, I loved very much your Geneva Call booklet here, because you're telling us in this booklet, I have to behave as a combatant because I am, he said, because A, I am Pashtun, so you see the cultural ethnic element. As a Pashtun, I have to respect a certain dose of rules when I'm in combat, and B, because I'm a Muslim. But he started with the cultural aspect and then came to the religious one. And the third element is training, which we do with a variety of groups out there. If they don't know that many of the groups, when we get to them for the first time, they don't even know that as weapon carriers, they fall immediately under a piece of international law called the Geneva Conventions or International Humanitarian Law that obliges them, but also gives them protection. Often the questions they ask is, if I fall into the hands of the army or the enemies in front, do I have the right of the status of prisoners of war? And in the vast majority of the places where we work, they do have this right, but to enjoy this right, they have to behave according to the conventions. Now, on the sides of the states, I think there is another, I mean, I very much agree with what Gassam said. The tendency when states don't want to make politics and don't have the courage to do politics is for them to do humanitarian. I give you an example. Last UN General Assembly in New York, sorry, I'm invited to speak at a panel where you have most donors, agencies of the world represented, about Sudan. And you hear the European Union saying how much they will put to help the refugees on the Chadian border, the United States saying how much they will give, and so on. And when I took the floor, I said, listen, Sudan is complicated. There are a lot of armed groups in Darfur, in Kordofan, in Blue Nile. We know them, we've been in there for 15 years, okay? But with the massacres that happen now, there is one aspect of this war which is so simple. You have two old gentlemen destroying their country for their own ego, bombing civilians in a capital city of 8 million. And I'm sorry, I'm small Geneva Call, you are the big states. I was sitting next to the deputy director of USAID. They said, so what you're telling me, you, the American government, is that you're putting money just to pay for the catastrophe and the destruction that these guys are doing. You're the United States of America. Me, as a humanitarian, what I expect from big states like you is to ensure that these guys stop doing that with their own country. And so this positioning sometimes by lack of political courage or lack of political will to shift everything on the humanitarian side is very much a problematic of the days. And I will finish by saying one thing that is really concerning to us. When Geneva Call was created 23 years ago, it was creating because you had several armed groups out there who were doing bad things and they didn't really know what the obligations are. Today, as we speak, we consider in Geneva Call, but these statistics, take them with a grain of salt because they are not easy to come up with, that we have 175 million people living in areas either under the direct control of armed groups or whose lives are daily affected by the behavior of armed groups. And I don't want to bet with you on a pessimistic view, but next year at the forum, I think we will be over 200 million. So the map of the world, of these zones which are outside government controls, is just growing. Take the Sahel. Look at the map of the Sahel today. Look at the borders in the Sahel. Do the border of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger still exist concretely on the ground? We're engaging armed groups for years. We've been engaging them in the north of Mali. They are already moving across all these borders. You have jihadist groups coming down from the north, already building an arc of instability all around Burkina Faso, down to Côte d'Ivoire on one side, the north of Ghana, the north of Benin, the north of Togo on the other side. And this is a major issue, and I was happy to hear Gaza very angry with the United Nations. At the United Nations General Assembly this year in New York, I felt a little bit that I was in the wrong place. I could see these big convoys of black Mercedes coming in with heads of states of countries where we are working, in which the head of state controls less than a third of the territory of his state. And all the other ones who are calling the shots, and are calling the shots for the future, because they are building something new, which is dangerous, chaotic. We don't know what will come out of this. But these guys, those who call the real shots on the ground, are not in New York. And hence, the necessity to keep this, if there is one thing I would like you to keep from my intervention, is this figure. 175 million people living in territories under the control of armed groups. Can I ask a question? How many inhabitants does France have? Who knows? How many? 67 million, you're right, thank you. So 67 million is France. I'm saying 175 million. And it is impossible to ignore this phenomenon as ignoring a 30-year conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh proved totally explosive. We've seen the result. Ignoring the situation of the Palestinians for 70 years is totally explosive, as we see today. And when you have the allied, and it has been underlined by several of my fellow speakers here, when you have allied of the democratic states feeling that they can disregard completely IHL and kill civilians for any reason, we are going into a very chaotic world. And we still have the possibility right now to reverse this trend.
So what we see is international humanitarian law attacked on two fronts, so to speak, by armed groups which commit sometimes atrocities, take civilian hostages, and by states who do not respect to attack humanitarian law. That's for an organization like the United Nations, which is an organization of states. So states don't control, many territories are not controlled by states, and states do not respect the UN Charter and the basic rules of international law. So I want to ask Mrs. Rabbani-Carr, until recently Foreign Minister of Pakistan, and I will refer to what Hassan said and to what you just said, Alain. Hassan said that the consequences of what's happening are horrible, of course, for the people in Gaza, for humanitarian international law, but they have a broader impact for the whole idea of multilateralism, of a world governed by law. And you're looking at that from Pakistan, and you look at the Europeans, you look at the Americans, you look at the various parts of the world and how they react to that, and how the countries that, in a way, shape that order today watch it unravel. And so what do you think should be done? What can be done?
Okay, so, we talked about this earlier. I think this is very simple and also very, very complicated. Okay, the simplicity of it lies in the fact that we don't build rules to break them. And if we build rules to break them, and the vocabulary nowadays is the deep tunnels that we believe Hamas has, it's almost like the world has come together to build a great structure of humanitarian laws, of Geneva Convention, of respect for human rights, of development rights, etc. And then really important countries have built deep tunnels under those great castles of humanitarian law, etc., to find exceptions to deliver to their allies and to themselves. All of that is a very, very costly enterprise. You know, I don't pretend to be a great student of history, and I know as a colonized country that I have read about the War of Independence of 1857 as the Mutiny of 1857, because it was the history that I was reading of the colonizer rather than the colonized. In the same way, I can't pretend to talk about what happened World War I, World War II, but I've read about it, right? And I've often wondered, how could humanity sit by and allow such atrocities to happen? And today we all sit in fancy places called peace forums, and we are seeing live on television screen atrocities happen which are of a proportion which none of us have the ability to live with or to accept or to understand. And therefore, a language of peace and humanitarianism must be used to explain why that is happening by those who are not only propagators of it, but are complicit. So there is not only two types of states, those who respect law and those who don't. There are those who do not respect law, and even a greater crime of those who are complicit in allowing them to get away with it, right? I think we don't allow the burden of what this world has experienced to actually fall or to be felt. On two counts, because exceptionalism is very interesting, and hypocrisy comes back to haunt you one way or the other. Okay, so the last year, all of the global South was listening to calls of, wanting to put us in the hall of shame of not really calling out Russia as one should, really, at the same level, and Russia being able to use its veto. Do you know how many times the United States of America has used its veto against ceasefire and humanitarian pauses? Is that even human? And do you know that many other Western countries have, on the first resolution to go for a ceasefire was actually rejected by all, the veto was used by all three Western countries. And you expect us to believe that this is the order that you are trying to promote and we are supposed to all happily follow that? There is also the precedent. There's also this very important thing that from where I come, it's a lesson that we learned. And it's a lesson that the world really did not understand. But I think now it is so blatantly out there that we can't miss it. Even a child can see it, right? And the lesson is that how we conduct wars and what we do has repercussions. Okay? And I genuinely believe in the post-9/11 wars that we've conducted, we have actually created far more violence, conflict, and extremism than the one that we went out to sort out in the first place, right? We know about Guantanamo Bay, we know about Abu Ghraib, drone strikes, and the precedent that we created. Right now we're talking about how self-defense, how far can you go in self-defense? 60 terrorists is what the Israel government tells us is what they've gotten for 10,000 civilians. 10,000 civilians bombed in their homes, okay? So I remember when this drone strike thing was happening, and we were against it because we thought that every time you try and take one target out, you're creating 10 more targets because you're killing people with impunity and, creating more terrorists than the ones that you went out to. Now, today, we have evidence to prove that has actually happened. Now, the precedents that large, very big, powerful countries created by working around international law to normalize two things. First of all, drone strikes, which are not exactly legal, perhaps, in another territory where you have not been authorized with the United Nations, and then normalize collateral damage. And today, our appetite for collateral damage is 10,000 Palestinians' lives, and more, and still counting. We are nowhere close to a solution. So I get over, I don't even know whether to call ourselves humans, because when somebody calls the Palestinians animals, I think that's almost a compliment. Animals don't go and kill their own. We go and kill our own. And when he sits here and says that the first thing we should be able to do is to get electricity back in Al-Shifa, and that seems to be an ask that we are not able to provide. And then we have the European Union president, and I think it's important to call out, as a woman diplomat, when you see someone saying that we will stop humanitarian aid to all of Palestinians, and then to actually talk about, when water, food, electricity is cut to Ukrainians, it's a war crime for the European Union. But when it's cut out for Palestinians, it is fair game. The exceptions that we're making, they are going to come back to haunt us. We are a common humanity. Climate change is telling us that. Everything is, there will be no national boundaries to defend ourselves from the wrath that we are going to unravel through the wrath that we are showing to our other fellow humans. And I think we all have to just simply come out of the positions that we very happily, try and defend ourselves with. Sometimes it's religious positions, sometimes it's national positions, sometimes it's gender-based positions. The only position that we actually really need to stand by is the positions as humans, right? And I just want to end by saying that as someone who has served in government, both as foreign minister, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Minister of State for Economic Affairs, I know what it's like to be in government. I know that we feel that it's our job to defend positions. Really, our job should be to defend principles. And if you're able to do that, and I just want to also say that I think we have allowed great, great wrongs to pass, and we have gotten away with it. We've gotten away with Afghanistan. We've gotten away with Iraq. Remember the WMD false evidence that was shown in the United Nations? We have gotten away. We think we will keep on getting away. This, I think, is far too much for us, for anyone to absorb. And the reaction to this will know no boundaries. And I don't want to be, a harbinger of, terrible, but I'm sorry, we cannot be optimistic when we are sitting on oceans of depravity and on oceans of real human, killing and just dehumanization and weaponizing the humanitarian laws and weaponizing the development assistance. And please, to all the Western countries, I think you cannot appease your conscience by giving humanitarian assistance here, there, and everywhere, which lands like 10 years late. First, you take away the right to live and the right to live in their own lands. Then you say, allow others to give the right to annex. Then you don't give. You do all of that, and then you say, we will continue with humanitarian assistance, and that is supposed to appease our conscience. I think such things should not be allowed to function anymore.
Thank you. I know that Hassan Salameh had to leave. Hassan Salameh had to leave us because the panel was moved half an hour later, and I know he had another appointment, so sorry that he has to leave, but thank you to him for having stayed with us for a while. What you were saying about the origins of the whole thing, and you referred to 9/11. And I remember very well being in the chamber of the United Nations Security Council a couple of days after 9/11, when a resolution was adopted by the Security Council. And the Russian ambassador was a man called Sergei Lavrov. And I remember him smiling and saying, oh, we have extended the right of self-defense considerably with the resolution that was adopted, because it was the beginning, in a way, of the so-called global war on terror. And ever since, we have seen that erosion of international law, because the balance that had been struck by the UN Charter in 1945 saw the use of force, the unilateral use of force by a state, as the exception, famous idea of self-defense that several of you referred to. But the notion, the definition of self-defense is now much broader than it was when it was designed in 1945, when the idea was that self-defense is against an army that crosses a border. This was the experience of World War II. So it is a clear-cut case. But now we have all sorts of situations where it's not a clear-cut case, and nevertheless, states invoke self-defense. But here we are. And I want to ask you, after this discussion, and I will turn to you, Udo, because we have spoken a lot about the impact, the worldwide impact of Gaza on the idea of trust. But as you observe all the conflicts in which you are involved, and in a way your work is in some ways similar to what the Geneva Call does, how do you see in those conflicts the possibility of restoring confidence in international humanitarian law, confidence and respect
Thank you very much. Like I said earlier, there's no alternative to those international humanitarian law principles and values. And I also said that first, we're humans. And we're not supposed to need laws to not kill each other, frankly. But, here we are. So there is, in the world now, we've got all these competing global interests and polarization, and each bloc trying to outsmart the other, position themselves as the best. Perhaps this is the time for all of these blocs to use the protection of civilians in conflict as the bargaining chip of saying we are different, we are better than the rest. Because if we don't get that level of global leadership in pushing these principles, we are in for serious trouble. So leadership, global respect should be one premise on the dignity of the human person, one premise on the protection of civilians. The second thing I need to put on the table is that communities in conflict know their needs more than we do. They know their protection needs more than anyone else. And there's a powerful agency there that is not being supported, especially in a time where our political leadership are behaving with this kind of reckless disregard for lives. And so perhaps we should start thinking of ways to build up on that agency so that people can also be the vanguards of their own protection. So that our decisions as funders, as NGOs, as development partners, as humanitarians, is informed by the actual needs of the communities that we claim to serve. The third thing I want to say, and I need to emphasize this, no military objective, no sovereignty argument, no territorial argument can justify the indiscriminate destruction of lives. And I think these are basic principles that we can all agree as human beings. We are not collateral damage. It is not enough to say, I have followed all the rules of war so people can die. It just doesn't make sense. It makes us look like animals, frankly. And increasingly, we are hearing this argument about territorial integrity. We are hearing this argument about self-defense. We're hearing this argument about retaliation. Even the International Criminal Court on Yugoslavia said it clearly. Even when you're trying to respond to an attack, it does not excuse you from respecting international humanitarian law. It does not excuse you from not protecting civilians. And since the political leadership is failing, we have to find more pressure points. And that's why I said that the leadership we should recognize going forward at the global level is a leadership that is consistent, whether their friends are involved or the enemies are involved, in the protection of civilians and in the respect of international humanitarian law.
I think you're reminding us of a fundamental issue and a fundamental misunderstanding of many people about proportionality. Proportionality is not about proportioning the response to the attack in international humanitarian law, because that would be eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Proportionality is about accepting that there may be some civilian casualties, but they have to be proportionate to the military objective that is pursued. That is the concept of international humanitarian law. But I see that time is moving on, and I should like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Yes, sir. Introduce yourself.
Great. I'm Matko Grubelnik. I'm head of Artificial Intelligence Department at Natural Science Research Institute. Nothing special, really, for this discussion, I guess. As I see, right, so autonomous weapons, well, is one of these topics which was always kind of everybody was against. But now, I mean, it seems like the present wars, it's cheaper to have autonomous weapons doesn't need any infrastructure, communication infrastructure, no need to people, more precise, and so on. So it's actually, well, armies are incentivized to have this. No, I don't have really any expectation you will answer how to prevent this, right? But seems like, well, there's no God in these wars, right? So, and is there any, since we talk about rules of war, right? As the title of the panel, right? This is one of the rules, right? Seems like that it should be. So do you have any hope that autonomous weapons will be taken out of it or not?
Anybody wants to?
I'm just going to say from the fact that when drone strikes were relatively new, and when there's no cost of life to the aggressor or to the one who's using that equipment, as opposed to there's no risk. You tend to be very, very living in a very risk-free environment, right? And I think, so the answer is, the simple answer is no. I don't think so at all. I think, frankly speaking, this will go on and become further and further and more dangerous as we go forward. So no, I don't think this is going to.
Any other question?
Bonjour, je parlais en français pour m'expliquer.
I'm going to speak in French because I'm not fluent enough in English. My name is Guy Christian and I work for a platform that's currently being established to fight against digital pollution and toxicity. My question is on the topic at hand for this panel.
Est-ce que je peux lire le thème, s'il vous plaît? Les règles, voilà.
Stopping the war on the rules of war. Such is the title of this panel. So perhaps could we say that in the current state of world affairs, certain countries are looking to use to leverage their soft and hard power with war. So perhaps institutions could solve that kind of a problem, given that this competition is at hand. I mean, certain countries which are underdeveloped, so to speak, they'll always be running behind more developed countries. So maybe there's a question of balance here. As far as I'm concerned, I believe that we would need to create a new form of governance. We need to give impetus, renewed impetus to civil society organizations, to the civil society at large, so as to strike that balance. For as long as there will be powers that they will be looking to leverage on their power through war. So that's the question I wanted to address to you. Thank you. And apologies for such a long and convoluted question. Well, I come from a small country, but we all know about these strategies with regards to our neighbors.
Is an answer to your question. You see the great powers with their highly technological armies being defeated everywhere. Think of Afghanistan, okay? And you see these local actors taking the new technologies that you mentioned. We see them. I mean, we're all the time out there with armed groups in the territories they control. They are very quick in managing these new, fabricating themselves, adapting their drones and all that. And this is a new source of power, which is chaotic, which is bloody, which is dangerous, but we are just seeing in front of our eyes a new world being designed.
Yes, the lady on the third row.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Petra. I'm a researcher with Sciences Po. And you mentioned now and before that we're heading into an increasingly chaotic world. We still have time to change this. So I would like to qualify that statement a little bit and ask that at the institutional level, what needs to change and what can change? What is realistic right now? Thank you.
Maybe we could have each member of the panel could have a sort of concluding sentence on that critical question. You want to start?
Okay. I think we've said it over and over again. What needs to change is the behavior. The problem is not in the laws. The problems are in the implementation of the International Humanitarian Law. So behavior has to change. And the other thing I need to also say is that as we have this conversation about the International Humanitarian Law regime and all the principles around it, we also have to factor in and think about the communities in conflict, the powerful agency that they have, for which we need to work on, for which we need to support, so that they can articulate their protection needs, so that they can be treated as subjects and not as just victims. And that's, at least where I work in Civic, that is what we try to do to ensure that these people have a voice in what concerns their life.
Well, I think I will concentrate on the democratic countries. I think they still have a game to play, very hard cards to play. But our democratic countries are also now a bit chaotic, you see, with the kind of people we elect all over the place. And we sorry, did I say something I shouldn't? But okay, the problem, particularly with the West, with Europe and North America, is the arrogance. This arrogance going out there, teaching the world how they have to live, is just going down, not going down with anybody else now. And we heard the minister this morning in the panel where you made this point very strongly. And the recognition of the weaknesses and what we used to say in Geneva Call when we talk about the Geneva Conventions with armed groups, we have to deeply de-Westernize what is universal. And the principle, these basic principles of a limitation to the exercise of violence are principles you find everywhere in each single culture of the world. Humility, being a little bit also more consistent with the decisions we made. I think we heard the difference, the reaction of European countries on Ukraine and Israel. I think, okay, let's be consistent on our decision, and let us not forget that the rest of the world is not buying anymore our narrative on the world.
Yeah, I think what we have taken for granted in the Western world, I believe, in the last 3 decades, first of all, the unipolar decades have been very costly to humanity, I think, is my assessment, because it has allowed a certain set of countries to not only do what they please, but also do it in the garb of legality and create new legal frameworks to be able to do what is very, very costly. So it has been very, very costly, as I said. But I think that ability, the credibility and trust of the West and their modus operandi is at its lowest possible. But it's almost like the emperor's new clothes. The West is not getting it, right? They think that people are still buying what they're selling in terms of their commitment to human rights, their commitment to human values, their commitment to democracy. I will just want to put this as my final line. The threat to democracy and liberal order is not coming in from autocratic states. It is coming from the very deeply democratic states, and the builders of this order are the ones who are most uniquely today found to be its biggest breakers.
Peter Wagner.
Difficult, but no, it's also easy, because I think being here a representative of the EU, I would really claim that peaceful solutions to differences in multilateralism are at the core. That's part of our DNA. That's how we've been created and how we've been functioning for many years. And despite all the occasional skepticism, the fact that there's still more people who want to join us than people who want to leave us still has a bit of a message in it. Therefore, for me, the question is, and that is not arrogance, that is really said in all the humility that is necessary here, that how can we build on this experience that we had on this continent, at least with part of the continents, without now what Alain summarized under falling into the arrogance with which we are indeed very often appearing, and still showing that a lot of what is part of this DNA is not purely Western. Some parts are what you would call Western, but some of these are global values. And I would also like to say that I like or dislike the concept of the West as much as I dislike the concept of the global South. Both are concepts with which we throw around these days even more than in the past, and it's even more dangerous than it ever was.
Thank you. I think we will conclude on that wise sentence. And we see, I think this kind of debate is very useful because we put on the table the reality of the differences of perception, the need for action, the fact that institutions are as good as the political communities that support them. Yeah. Institutions that can consolidate things, they cannot substitute for the people behind them. And so here we are at a moment where we have a responsibility in maintaining institutions that have done good, but that can sound hollow if they are not able to respond to the challenges to the tragedies, actually, that we are facing now. Thank you.